Recording in progress.
Okay. So it is my great pleasure to be here. There we go. Okay. It is my great pleasure to be here at Waseda. I actually grew up in Okinawa, Japan, when I was very young. Oh, I see. There we go. So I grew up in Okinawa. My father is fluent, but I am not. So I apologize. I wish I could give my presentation in Japanese, but I will try to do it very clearly in English. I have with you 3 sessions. We have one today, one tomorrow, and one on Wednesday. And I study metaphysics and medieval philosophy. I work in contemporary metaphysics. So I work a lot in problems with composition of material objects. My first book was on how material objects have parts and wholes. And I will tell you a little bit about that today. And I also have written things on free will. So I am also interested in free will and some issues in philosophy of science. So that's actually what I do. My historical material is in medieval philosophy. I worked on Aquinas as well as on medieval Chinese philosophy. Medieval, I mean Song Dynasty, the same time as Aquinas, basically, 1000 to 1200. And I am interested in the Cheng brothers, Cheng Yi, Cheng Hao, and Zhu Xi is the one I wrote some in my book. My dissertation was published as a book called Material Objects in Confucian and Aristotelian Metaphysics. After that, I have also been working more recently in political philosophy. I will not talk much about that today. I wrote an edited book on political philosophy, and I am hoping to write another one soon, a full book on political philosophy. And I also have 2 books now on philosophy of religion, because I have been interested in, I get into fights with people on the internet, arguing with people. And I produced 2 books from my fighting with people on the internet. One is about hell, not a hope in hell. So I hope you have questions about hell, because I'm the one, I can answer all your questions about hell, everything you want to know. And I have a book on, it's called Whoever Hears You Hear. So the book on hell is called Not a Hope in Hell. The other book I just wrote is called Whoever Hears You Hears Me, Dogmatic Authority as Testimony. It's a book on authority in the church, in Christianity. And it is a sort of book on ecclesiology, which is structure of the church. I argue that we can use philosophy, political philosophy, to resolve some problems in our contemporary fights between Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox Christians. So I have lots of crazy interests all over the place. But today I wanted to give you, the next 3 days will be an introduction to Aquinas and then a little introduction to Confucianism. Have you studied Confucianism at all? Everybody here is new. Okay. I will have to tell you a little bit about Confucianism, but good for me. You don't know anything, so everything I tell you will be true. No arguments, no objections. Okay, good. But I will tell you first about Aquinas, and it sounds like many of you have already studied some of him before. So here's what will maybe be interesting in my presentation today for you, the next 2 days, is I will be answering perhaps some questions, or I will be applying Aquinas in perhaps a way you might not have known before. I will be talking about Aquinas from the perspective of contemporary metaphysics a few different times. So I will be talking about things you might not have encountered. Have you studied analytic metaphysics before? Contemporary metaphysics? Have you taken a class in contemporary metaphysics? David Lewis, David Armstrong, those people? No, just a little bit. Okay. So I will talk a little bit about that. Welcome. Yay. Always happy to have more. Please come on up. I will come back to you after the question and answer because we have just finished introducing ourselves. So here's what I will do. Most of you know a little Thomas Aquinas. You know who he is, I imagine. So as you might know, Thomas Aquinas was a member of my group from the Middle Ages. We are called the Dominican Friars. You might notice Thomas is wearing black. That's because we wear a black cape over this, but it is too hot. I am not wearing my black cape because it is too hot. Normally, we do not wear it outside when it is too hot. And nowadays, unless it's raining or cold, we don't wear it. But that's why he's wearing black. He is wearing the same outfit I am in the picture. So that's what I have here. He lived in 1225 to 1274 or 5. He was a member of the Order of Friars Preachers. That is the full English name of the Dominicans. So I have the OP after my name because I am a Dominican. He taught at the University of Paris, and he held the Dominican chair of theology. So he was a theology professor in the Middle Ages. We were talking earlier about Albert the Great. Albertus Magnus was another Dominican who was his professor, who taught him, from whom he got his original philosophical study was with Albert the Great in Cologne, Germany. He was a very famous innovator because he was a scientist, natural philosophy, philosophy of nature, which was like philosophy of science today. Very similar idea. And he was also, we were talking because Dr. Utah also studies the Islamic tradition. Albert the Great was influential in having the Arabic philosophers translated into Latin and teaching all his students, including Aquinas. So Aquinas knew quite a lot of different philosophers, actually. He was exposed to a wide range of thought when he studied philosophy and theology in Paris. In particular, you might know Augustine was the great theologian of the Latin Church. So he wrote a whole bunch of theology that was the basis for most people's theological formation in the Middle Ages. Theologians had to study Augustine, and then another man, Peter Lombard. He had a sort of textbook of theology. So those were the two big sources for theology in the Middle Ages, apart from the Bible. But they would have studied Augustine. But Aquinas had a big background in lots of other people through Albert. Specifically, they had rediscovered the writings of Aristotle, of course, but also Neoplatonic authors, Plotinus. Aquinas had read the Enneads and some other works of Plotinus because he comments on them. The De Causis, which is also a series of excerpts from Proclus. He had exposure to Jewish philosophers, specifically Moses ben Maimonides. And he also had a little bit, I think, of Solomon ibn Gabriel, who's another medieval Jewish scholar. And then he also, as I mentioned, had connection to Avicenna and Averroes in particular. I don't know if he knew any more off the top of my head. But anyway, he's most famous because he has a kind of synthesis. I'd say most people know him because of his position on combining, as it were, theology and philosophy. So his kind of perspective has gotten famous among many people because of the way that he, even though he's a theologian, had no fear of science, philosophy, and had a synthesis of all these people, all the insights of the philosophers and theologians who came before him. In Christianity, he's also impressive for that. Not only did he know Augustine, not only did he know Anselm, who we were talking about, he didn't just know them. He also discovered the Greek fathers, the most important being John of Damascus, John Damascene, who he read very closely. He's one of the most cited people in his work. Another he knew very well were the Greek fathers, Basil, Gregory Nazianzen, Gregory of Nyssa. He had a very wide knowledge of these scholars. Although they were in translation, he had read a lot of the Eastern fathers as well. So a lot of his theology and philosophy is a great synthesis of all these figures. And that's what I think he is known for very much. So he wrote commentaries on the Bible, on scripture, and some independent philosophical works like De Ente et Essentia, as well as commentaries on Aristotle's Metaphysics, on many other philosophical and theological works. So the most important or famous are the Summa Theologiae and the Summa Contra Gentiles, two different works. I'm not going to do much with any of that today. I'm not going to be speaking about history today. I just bring this so that you have the basics, the frame, okay? But my interest with you over the next 3 days is just systematic. I am going to be telling you what he thinks. And to a great extent, I'm not going to be doing very much textual work. I am interested in the truth. And I'm going to tell you what I think in his metaphysics, what motivates it, and the sort of basic implications. So the outline for today is like this. I am going to present you with Aquinas' metaphysics in this way, as a solution to two problems. So I will be looking at, first, change. In particular, not all change is chemical change, but this is a very good example of what we mean by chemical change, the kind of change Aquinas was dealing with in his metaphysics. Now, the way I am using metaphysics in this discussion is going to be contemporary use of the word metaphysics. Why do I say that? The medievals, as I just mentioned with Albert, distinguished metaphysics and philosophy of nature. So some of this is really philosophy of nature for the medievals. They would not have thought of it as metaphysics exactly. Metaphysics is connected with Aristotle's work, The Metaphysics, and it was more interested in questions like, are there immaterial substances? How do we think of angels? How do we think of God? How do we think of the causes of everything, all being? I will get to that. But you can't understand any of that unless you have the basic, what they would call physics, philosophy of nature, which is what I'm going to start off with. Today, we call all of this metaphysics. So that's why I'm going to use the contemporary term, because actually I think it's closer in many respects, or I think that there's an important overlap here. But the two problems I'm going to be looking at are change and wholes and parts of objects. Okay? These are two very famous problems in contemporary philosophy. This one is usually understood as identity over time, problems identity over time, and this one is, we might say, identity at a time. So I have lots of parts right now. I have my feet and my hands and my hair, and they are all parts of me. What makes them one? I'm one thing, right? You're one thing. What makes all the parts one? These problems of parts also can be over time, right? Because I just had some nice udon noodles outside, and the udon is becoming a part of me right now, and I will lose parts over time, right? I will not mention how I will lose some parts maybe later tomorrow, but that can be over time. But the question is, what makes them one when they are part of me? These might not involve parts at all, just change, problems of change. So we have iron rusting, burning wood, cooking an egg, baking a cake, lots of chemical changes. Okay, so I will start with the problem of change and come back to the problem of parts, because both of them for Aquinas are very closely related problems. And then I will give you three implications of Aquinas's metaphysics from these problems, from how he deals with them. Okay? So here's a famous ancient Greek philosopher, pre-Socratic, before Socrates, Parmenides. We can speak and think only of what exists. And what exists is uncreated and imperishable, for it is whole and unchanging, complete. It was not or shall be different, since it is now all at once one and continuous. This is a fragment from this pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides. And Aquinas and Aristotle, Plato in particular, were puzzled by the problems associated with Parmenides and one of his famous students. Do you know his famous student who denied that you could move across the room? Who was that? The famous student of Parmenides. He said, if I shoot an arrow, it will never, he had these paradoxes of motion. Do you know who that is? Zeno, correct. So Parmenides and Zeno had problems with change. This is a fragment, but Parmenides might give us a good reason why they had the problems. Here's the problem they had. Only what exists is something we can talk about. But things that are changing, to change, you have to not be a certain way, right? If I am going to get hot, right, or get colder than I am, I want to turn on the air conditioning and make the room colder. It has to not be cold. But to not be something is to not exist. How can you talk about something that doesn't exist? Something that doesn't exist isn't there, is no way at all. So they had many of these paradoxes that it looks like things that change don't really exist at all, or there's some problem. Change should be an illusion. That's the point of Zeno's paradoxes, is to show us that change could not happen. It's somehow an illusion. No change is really possible. Aquinas and Aristotle, I should say before him, come up with a kind of solution to this. So there's Megarians from Megara in Greece, and Parmenides had a kind of paradox of change. As I said, I'm not into the history here today, so I'm being very brief. But the idea was something coming from what is not. But something cannot come from nothing, right? So if the room is hot now and I want to make it cold, it looks like that's impossible. How can what is cold come from what is not cold? That looks like there's a contradiction. There's some problem here, some impossibility. So here is the basic solution Aristotle provided, and it was the basic linchpin of Aristotle's metaphysics. He drew a distinction. He got it probably from Plato, okay? The distinction is there are some things that Parmenides and Zeno made a mistake. The room is hot now. It is not cold. But being not cold is not just being not cold. A hot room is potentially cold, right? There are some things that are not potentially cold. The color red is not potentially cold. The number 2 is not potentially cold. A room is potentially cold. And being potentially cold is able to be cooled. That's a real property. That's not nothing. But that's how Parmenides and Zeno thought of not cold. They thought of it as nothing at all. Well, Aristotle says if we draw that distinction, we can make sense of change. Is potential versus actual. So we actually use this in physics. I just took this from a university in New Zealand, okay, their physics department. But we actually use the terms Aristotle invented today in physics. It's still used. Here's the case. Potential kinetic energy and actual kinetic energy. We don't use actual, we just call it kinetic energy then. But in fact, the point Aristotle is making is potential energy is real. It is not just nothing, right? There's something real there. And when you drop the ball, or in this case, I could drop my pointer, I convert potential into act, right? I convert potential into act. So we have to distinguish act and potency. These are technical terms. So I'm just using the typical English way we talk about it, but they're kind of abstract. So you have to get the terminology a little bit. So act and potency, and they drew a distinction, Aristotle did, between two ways something could be actual. There are many ways things could be actual or potential, and they're not all the same. So Aristotle said there's first order, act and potency. These are what he called first substances or primary substance. So here's the thing. Before this pointer can fall, right, can have potential and actual kinetic energy, but because it exists. If it didn't exist, it couldn't do either of those things. So they distinguish being a pointer. There has to be one first. But that's a kind of act too. That's actuality. You could be actually a pointer or just a pile of parts that hasn't been put together yet, right? So you could be potentially a pointer or actually a pointer. That would be a first order actuality. The pointer exists. It is able to be a subject. And then once it is able to be a subject, then the pointer can be hot, cold, up, down, falling, potential, kinetic energy. It has second order act potency, only in subjects, right? Something could be some way. So this second order is some way the subject could be. The pointer is falling. That's one way the pointer is. The pointer is black. That's one way the pointer is. The pointer is hot. That's one way it is. So that's a second order potency or act in this case, because the pointer can be certain ways. The pointer cannot be, for instance, 10,000 degrees Kelvin, right? If I heated this up to 10,000 degree Kelvin, it would probably turn into a gas, right? So it would not be possible for it to be, given the kind of thing it is, it can have certain properties or ways it could be, but not everything, right? Because certain subjects can take certain properties. We can be musical, right? How many of you know how to play a musical instrument? Piano, violin. Good people. I don't. I'm very bad at music. I played music, piano and organ and sang, but I'm very bad at it. But this cannot be musical, right? So different things can have different potencies. This is another application of Aristotle's idea. Subjects have certain ways they could be, but not everything. Not every subject can be every way. Pointers can't learn how to play piano. I can learn how to play piano, but neither of us can be 10,000 Kelvin. We'd both be gone, okay? So here then is the, let's say, Thomistic moves. Now we get into how Thomas Aquinas expands the basic idea, okay? The basic idea gets expanded by Aquinas in a number of different ways. This is not just Aquinas. This is from a whole series of people before Aquinas, like Augustine, Boethius, Proclus. There's a whole development, but this is the picture later, okay? Aquinas basically thinks, I have on the left here one distinction that is important, which is he connects the second order act potency distinctions apply to two different kinds of things. Having a property is a second order actuality of some subject, or having a part. So here's the idea. Sometimes I have parts, like my hand being a part of me. My hand has potential to be a part of me, and it actually is a part of me when it is connected appropriately. So being actual, as I mentioned in this way, requires a corresponding potential in that part, right? Or in the subject. That was what I meant by 10,000 degrees Kelvin. Here's another thing that is Aquinas' unique contribution. He gets this from the Muslim philosophers, but this is his own unique contribution. He says having an essence is also a kind of act, potency, composition. So anything that exists, Aquinas thinks, is generally a composition of act and potency. Some potential is actualized. This is a general idea for like everything except God, okay? Everything has act, potency distinctions. And so you can apply it to lots of things. Here's one thing he applies it to that makes him kind of special in Aquinas' metaphysics. He thinks that what it is to be something is to have an essence. So he sometimes refers to it with a Latin term, quidditas, which just means whatness in English. It's actually just supposed to be pretty direct. It's whatever the thing is, what makes it what it is, okay? He thinks of this as a kind of act, potency, composition, because you can be something. Any definition involves a distinction between potential ways of being a kind of a subject. So what does that mean? I'm sorry, I'm going to illustrate very briefly. There's something called the Porphyrian tree. Have you studied this? You know the tree of Porphyry. So this is supposed to be a list of all the things that exist. If I want to define what exists, do you know what the top of the tree is supposed to be? Things. Things. What kinds of things exist? Well, we can divide it. The way they divide the tree, Aquinas thought, from Aristotle, good divisions are always with negations, having a kind of property or not having. So just to give you an illustration very briefly. Actually, I should do over here. So Aquinas and Aristotle from Porphyry had this kind of schema for defining everything and dividing the world, right? How do we classify what exists? So they thought we should start at the top and work down to the most specific differences from the most general. So here's the most general way anything could be that's a subject. It's a substance. It's not a property. So it's the opposite of property. Properties are in something else. Substances are not in something. So it's, again, a kind of, right, the same kind of thing. A little bit of, it's not quite the same division, but the idea is a substance. And then we can define down the tree to the kinds of things that exist. Material, not material substances. What are the not material substances? Do you know? For those of you who've studied some medieval philosophy?
Angels.
There you go.
So,
Angels and immaterial souls, maybe. Right? So these are disembodied. They're called separated. I'll put separated if they're substances, which some people don't know. So I will put a question mark there. And I'll just strike it out. Okay. Who knows? Okay. Angels are supposed to be immaterial substances. Over here, material, I'll just give you now the full breakdown. How do we get to human beings? This is how they define human being. Okay? Material substances, then do you know, sir, how we go down the tree here?
animate and inanimate.
Good. You're on top of it. I like this. I'm just going to put not A for each of these. Okay. Animate.
Animal. Plants.
Sensible.
Nothing. Insect.
Not S, right? And then what's the final infame species for human beings? Do you know? Animals that are sensible, that have senses, emotions, can seek things. So they're not plants, right? Not sensible is plant, right? Okay. What's the last division?
Rational.
Good. And that's how you define a human being. A human being is that thing. It's the thing that is a material substance that is animate, sensible, and rational. So you get, right, human is, in brief, rational animal, right? Okay, so, but this is, the point I'm trying to make with the Porphyrian tree here is just to show you there are many potential ways of being a substance, right? That's the point, right? So Aquinas has this idea that I think is actually a quite big one, that there's a potential to be a substance and it gets actualized in one way by each different thing that exists. And this kind of actualization is actually an act potency composite. So what he says is essence gets actualized, the actuality of a corporate a thing like us. We have a distinction in us between the potential to be a member of that species and actually being the member of that species. The potential is our essence, what we are, and the actuality is our actual existence. So we can think of how things exist in terms of this act potency composite very generally. So I'm going to sort of skip some of this in the interest of time, but I'll just say he uses these terms substance and accident. They roughly correspond to a subject, something that is a thing versus a property. I gave you that just a second ago. So there are, however, for Aquinas, there are different kinds of things. Everything he thinks are going to be members of natural kinds. The real things that exist, in his view, are going to be members of natural kinds. So only those things are substances for our purposes. We're just going to assume it. But here's what we mean by the opposite then of a natural kind. What is a natural kind? Well, dogs, humans, plants, those are all natural kinds. What is it not to be a member of a natural kind? Why does that matter? Artifacts are the opposite. What is an artifact? An artifact is, we can very provisionally say something made by us, something put together. I think actually put together is a much better way to define it because it doesn't have to be put together by us, by human beings. An artifact is just something put together. Why isn't an artifact a substance? Well, think of chairs, tables, piles of sand. In contemporary philosophy, we tend to refer to all these things as heaps, heaps, like a heap of sand, okay? Because if you take a pile of sand, heap it up, right? It doesn't hold together. There's no unity. It's not one thing. It's just a pile of things you've sort of pushed together, right? But you think of, well, what do you need to do to make all that pile of sand one thing? If I put a bunch of glue on it and glued it together like a little kid in school, art project, is it one thing? Well, not really. I just put a lot of glue in it. It's like cereal in milk. It's not one thing. It's just close together. It sticks together, but here's what they think is really important. In order to become one thing, all the parts, when they become part of the whole, have to change in what they are. So this is the basic way of the rule of thumb to figure out the difference between a substance and an artifact. If I put the things together and they're still the same that they were before, you haven't got a substance. No member of a natural kind has been generated. So if I put the sand together, nothing. But I can put the sand together and get a substance. How do I do that? How would I do that? Can you think of a way I can put sand together and get one thing? I can heat it up real hot. And when I heat it up real hot, I make glass. And glass is a chemical change. all of the particles of the sand, all the molecules that are parts of the rocks will either get burnt off, they have impurities in them, but the silicate and all that will break down and form glass, right? Glass is a crystalline structure that has undergone now a chemical change. And now if I have one big piece of glass, I've created a substance, I think, essentially. Now, here's what's important. I have just made a substance. So that's why sometimes artifact can be misleading, because for Aquinas, it doesn't mean we can generate substances sometimes. We can make them, like styrofoam, like chemicals in laboratories. We can make new things that are really substances. So you can have artificial substances like this, right? When I melt the sand and make glass, I've made a substance. The point is, it's not a heap. It is really somehow changed. All the parts have changed in their identity when I put them together in the right way. So here now, that's the basic framework. Okay, that's the basic framework. Now I'm going to give you 3 implications of the basic framework. And now I notice I have these backwards on my slide. So I will start off with this one. I have to skip a little ahead and then go back. So that's why I have this one. Let's do this one first. Form and matter. Here are my 3 implications. Okay. So form and matter are a big part of Aquinas and Aristotle's account of the world. A form and matter correspond basically to whatever is outside of my head, whatever out there is doing the actuality part. So in kinetic energy, with the things falling through space, they think of the actuality. Remember, I said it's a second order act of having actual kinetic energy. What I have done is there's a subject here, and it has a potential for kinetic energy. And when I let go of it, I am putting a form in it, basically. I have actualized other kinds of problems here. When I put these back in here, I am actualizing a circuit, right? Lots of different ways in which there are actuality and potentiality. They think of when it's actually some way, there's a form in it. It would be, however, what we call an accidental form. It's a form of a property, falling, moving, right? Substantial is because it's a substance. When it's an actual substance, when it's actual and exists, then it has its own substantial form. So for each human being, for instance, we are all members of natural kinds, and we all have a substantial form. It's an actuality in you, in you, in you, that makes all your parts one thing. What is the other word for the human substantial form?
Soul.
Soul, yes. So Aquinas and Aristotle think you all have one. They're particulars. Forms are particulars in this context. They're in the world. They're the things in the objects that make them one thing. So in this context, you have a soul, you have a soul, you have a soul, I have a soul. A soul is not a universal, right? It is yours, 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 because each of us are different material objects. So we each have a particular form. And then matter, then, in this, there are 2 different ways to think of matter. Matter in general is that potential in virtue of which something can belong to this genus. Anything that belongs to this set of things has matter as a kind of potential, because it's one potentially way of being a material object. But this gets 2 different ways. Matter in general is what they call prime matter. I will come back to that. Proximate matter is the stuff you're made of. So my stuff is arranged some way. Now, I think this is actually a very helpful way to think about it, because in contemporary physics, we kind of have terms for this stuff. So in me, I have something that is like the stuff I'm made of. Let's call that my matter. So my matter is this particular stuff, right, that is here under having these particular properties that's in my arm and all that. But there's something else in contemporary physics we call mass, or some mass is convertible with energy, right? This is the famous E equals mc squared, right? Convertibility of mass and energy. Mass, by contrast with the stuff I'm made of, is an abstract thing. Mass doesn't come in kinds, right? Because there's mass in the chair, in my arm, it's all the same mass, right? Mass is an abstract concept. But mass is real, right? Mass is in the chair, and mass can be converted into energy. And here's what the medievals meant by prime matter is very similar to mass, because they thought there's something important that happens when I break this down into its parts, or I eat some udon noodles. Happens over the change, which is the stuff it was made of turns into another kind of stuff in me, but something gets conserved over material changes. What gets conserved? Well, in contemporary physics, it's mass and energy, right? Mass and energy gets conserved over all changes. You start off with a certain amount of mass and energy, and through any material change, same amount mass and energy at the end, right? That's what gets conserved. In medieval philosophy, they called that prime matter, what got conserved. And prime matter is not a kind of stuff, right? It's not this stuff, because it's not like, they said very importantly, it can't be any kind of stuff, because then everything would be made of the same thing. So they said if everything is made of different stuff, whatever this is can't be any kind at all. That's why it's called prime matter. It's no kind of matter at all. It's like mass, conservation of mass. Mass is abstract, not any particular kind. So it's a principle that helps us explain how things change over time. Okay, so changing parts. Let me give you an explanation of how this is supposed to work then. How does all these moving parts come together? Well, let's say this cat is Tibbles, okay? Tibbles is in philosophy. This is Garfield, the cartoon, okay? He sheds atoms every day. And he doesn't have the same set of material parts today as Garfield did yesterday, right? Garfield likes eating lasagna, right? So he eats lasagna and then he poops in his litter box and then he eats more lasagna, right? What makes Garfield the same substance over these changes? Here's the explanation. The soul, the substantial form of Garfield. Garfield is one and the same cat because she has one and the same soul, not her material parts, because the parts change over time. They undergo lots of changes. So if we took those atoms and we took all the things in the litter box, right? Or we cut off parts of Garfield. Let's say, this is gruesome, okay? This is sad. We wouldn't do this to a cat. Very bad idea, okay? But let's imagine we cut off Garfield's legs and then his arms, and we have him on life support, right? And we grow parts from his parts, right? You can take stem cells from animals, right? And you could grow those stem cells into different organs or something, right? And we made a new cat, all from the parts of Garfield, right? So it was all his matter growing on its own in a petri dish, right? We grew a heart, lung, legs, everything, and made a new cat. Well, it wouldn't be Garfield. It would not be Garfield because it doesn't have the same form, the same particular form. It's a new life form made from things from Garfield, but not identical with her. In fact, here's the important claim. Once those things are removed from Garfield, like the atoms, they're no longer chemically part of him, well, then they've actually changed their identity, right? That's what you have to do to make anything a part or a whole, is it has to undergo a change in identity, like the sand had to undergo a chemical change. So if something stops being a part of Garfield, there has to be a real chemical change. So here's what happens. When I cut off Garfield's tail, whack, right? Chemical change, bonds break. Tail is no longer alive, right? Maybe it's got a little cell life going on, but it's not longer part of Garfield because of the chemical, physical change that occurred. So this is then the important result. Parts depend on their wholes to be the kind of thing they are, okay? So here's another important result for Aquinas' metaphysics. Many people think Christians believe we're all going to become ghosts, or that we're really ghosts right now. I'm a ghost in a big bag of meat. My soul is really me. I'm just trapped in a physical flesh pot, some crazy thing like that. But for Aquinas, that's false. Okay? This is important over here because this was the question. Are souls substances? For Aquinas, the answer, at least when they're part of you, is no. Here's what you are. You are an animal. I am an animal. That's what I am. So Aquinas thinks this is really important because here's an important result of this. Sorry for all the Japanese here in the room. Hindus and Japanese might have a problem with this. But in particular, Aquinas thinks these facts, because forms and parts are dependent on the wholes to which they belong, you can't have reincarnation. It's metaphysically impossible. My soul cannot become a part of a different kind of thing. So like my soul could not go move into a cat, right? Because a form is the form if it's a material object like I am. My form is the form of this stuff right here, this kind of stuff. And so if I put my soul into a cat, that wouldn't work, right? My soul couldn't inform cat stuff. It's just the structure of this physical material stuff here. So it can't be exchanged, right? Cat souls can't come into me. My soul can't go into cats. It's impossible, he thinks. So this is then a second result. This is also then why for Aquinas, he thinks the Christian faith doesn't teach we're ghosts. The Christian faith says at the end of time, God will raise us up in our material bodies. So existing as a soul for a little while after I'm dead is not really me, he says. He says, my soul is not me. It's just a part of me. And he thinks that's a very good reason why God would raise me up at the last day, because only then do I really exist again, when I'm back in my body, right? Because this is me. The soul is not me. That's just a part of me. So he thinks that actually tells us very, very importantly that the resurrection of the dead is really fitting, because otherwise there'd just be parts of us floating around. Ghosts are not human beings, is the basic thought. Ghosts are not human. They're a part of a human, maybe, but a ghost is not a human being. So if I want to exist again, God would have to bring me back from the dead. He can't just have my soul be with him forever. Okay? So this is then, form can exist by itself, but matter can't, is another important implication. So he thinks angels and God and human souls, when they are dead, when we're dead, our souls could be form alone. Because form, remember, is a kind of actuality. But something that is actual could potentially, if it wasn't the actuality of a material thing, could continue to exist on its own. So I can come back to that if you're interested, but that's just a side effect. So let's go to I think, a more interesting and direct implication. Good and being are convertible. This will come back next session. We're going to talk about Aquinas' ethics. So here's the most important result of his metaphysics for his ethics. What do I mean by good and being are convertible? So Aquinas uses this term convertible. I'm using it so if you see it written somewhere, you'll know what this means. But convertible is a technical term. Here's what they mean. In scholastic logic, they meant this. What we would call in contemporary philosophy, we have a distinction between referent and sense. Have you ever heard the distinction between referent and sense? Do you know the distinction between referent and sense? Anybody heard of that?
Sinn und Bedeutung.
Sinn und Bedeutung in German, but I don't know if you know in contemporary philosophy what they mean. So here's what I mean, okay? Sin, or meaning, sense, is like the concept or the meaning of the word, right? So let's imagine I have never seen computers before. Let's imagine I live on a desert island, okay? I grew up in Okinawa. So let's imagine I never saw a computer, okay? Well, you know what the word computer means. I might not know what the word computer means. Let's imagine I've never heard of it. Or here's another simple thing, right? Maybe I'm learning Chinese and I don't know what computer is in Chinese, right? Okay, but I know what this, but I can talk about this thing here, right? I say, well, it has a screen this size, it's glowing, it has a keyboard, right? I see it's made of plastic, it runs on electricity. So what I'm doing is, in English, we'd say, I'm referring to the computer. I'm talking about this thing. Referent is what I'm talking about, or what I'm thinking about, or what I'm pointing to. That's the referent, even if I don't have any concept or term for what this is. So the sense of my term would be, the sense in this context would be like computer, or the concept computer. I can sometimes refer to things without having a specific sense in mind. Okay. Sense and meaning are sense and reference are a sort of big division in philosophy of language. I'm just giving you a basic example here. Okay. I'm not really defining what sense and reference are, but you get the idea. Here's what he's saying. Here's one of his famous implications of his view. Aquinas thinks being, existing as something, and being a good thing, being good, are convertible. What that means is they're the same thing in reference, but not in sense. So let me say what that means now. Okay. They don't mean the same thing. An existing thing doesn't mean a good thing in English, right? Those are two different meanings, right? These two phrases mean different things. But here's what he says. What it is to be a good thing is just a way of saying something exists. Now, how could that be the case? Well, here's what Aquinas thinks good means, or good refers to. Good is a kind of being whole, or being perfect. That's what Aquinas thinks from the medieval tradition good means. Good is to be a good instance of some kind. Good is to be a kind of perfect instance of a kind. So if you have a kind like dog, right? There are good dogs and bad dogs. And I don't just mean now like well-behaved dogs. I mean like, remember I was talking about Garfield. If I cut off all the legs of my dog would be in very poor health, would probably die from blood loss. It would be a bad dog in the sense of not being a good instance of the kind dog, because it would have lots of problems, health problems. It would not be a dog is a kind of organism, right? Kind of organism, living thing. And so it has a certain system. And if the system is not working, it's not a good dog in this context. That's what good and bad means, he thinks. So a good instance of something is a perfect instance of the kind, or like a very high level perfect instance of the kind, right? Because there might not be a perfect one, right? But that's how you gauge what we mean by good and bad, is like living up to the kind, exemplifying the kind. Okay? But the way he thinks of it, that's just a different kind of being actual, right? Something that is a bad dog in this context, a sick dog, is less a dog than one that has lots of good making features, like its health is good, it's active, it's more fully a dog. So he thinks good and existing are correlative, which is the more you are an instance of a kind, the more you exist. You exist as a whole, or more perfectly. So good and being are convertible. Important scholastic idea. So then this is the same thing applies to each of us. So this is the ethics for tomorrow. Living well perfects us, makes us more human. So I think, by the way, I'm going to come back on the third day to Confucianism. There's actually a very good idea in Confucianism for this, right? They have two famous ideas. They think that the Neo-Confucians, Jushi, I don't know what his name is in Chinese, Jushi, the famous medieval philosopher in Confucianism, he thinks that when we are good, morally good, our nature shines through more, is more manifested in our physical stuff. We are more human. And so the great virtue in Confucianism is this one, Ren, which gets translated into English sometimes. I like it because it's good. It's a good translation. humaneness. Now, this is good because it's in terms of translation, because they often talk about being Ren is to be more human, more perfectly human. That's a very close idea for what we're talking about by virtue in this tradition too. Thomism thinks when you are virtuous, when you are morally good, you are more human. That's what it is to be virtuous, is to be more human. So that's the idea here. When you are good, you are more. When you are not good, you are less. So then, is everything naturally good? What about criminals? What about people that go bad, right? Are they good? Well, they exist, don't they? Right? So I'm going to skip. There's a good Mencius quote for you. Okay? Is everything naturally good? So here's an interesting fact from Aquinas. There were some people in the Middle Ages who thought that the material world was evil. Aquinas thought he could disprove them just from this philosophy, just from philosophy alone, because it wouldn't make sense for there to be truly evil things in the world, because evil is bad instance of existing. But now you think, how bad would you have to be truly evil? To be completely evil would be to not have being at all. But if you don't have being at all, you don't exist. There's nothing to be good or bad. So he thinks it's true to say something like the devil is good. The devil being, let's say, the most evil person that exists, Satan. But he exists. So nothing can be truly, completely evil. Evil is a kind of disorder, right? So you can think of it like this. Evil is like being sick, right? Evil is like being sick versus healthy. But if you said there's somebody, but they're only sick, they have no health at all, they're only sick. Well, that's a dead person. But dead people aren't people. Dead people aren't alive. So the devil might be very sick, morally speaking, but he still exists. He has a little bit of health, otherwise he wouldn't be alive. So everything that exists is like that. Everything has at least some being, otherwise it wouldn't exist. So not everything then is morally good. To say the devil exists and is good is not to say he's a very good person, right? If I say everything is good that God made, everything that exists is good, that doesn't mean there are no bad people in the world. It just means nobody could exist, could exist without being a little bit perfect, a little bit existing in some way, a little bit healthy. And this is important because it does have consequences. We're going to see with the Neo-Confucians, very good instance of what those consequences are. Here's a consequence. There's always a potential in you to be healthy, even if you're very sick. So for morality, that would be a big important point. You can always get better. You can always change. It's possible as long as you exist. And everything that's a bad human being is still a human being. And so you still have the potential to change. So there are some important ideas here, right? Evil seems to do a lot. So could evil be literally nothing on this picture? No, evil is not nothing. It gets called, in the medieval tradition from Augustine in particular, a lack. Privation is the technical word, privatio in Latin. A privation is a lack. What do we mean? A lack of what ought to be the case. So that's where I think sickness is a good analogy. Sickness is a lack of health, a lack of proper function, right? But if you totally had no function, you'd be dead, right? So you can only have a lack of function when you exist, when you're alive, right? But on this view, there could be nothing more. There's no such thing as something that has no function at all. Because if it did, then it wouldn't exist. There's no such thing. Everything that exists is good in some way. Okay, so we're almost at the end of time. I think I have 5 minutes, okay? So my last implication is going to be about God. Now, this is going to be a big one, okay? But I'm going to be very quick with it. I'm just going to point out, if you accept all the things I said so far, most of you look very very calm and peaceful, and you seem to have nodded and thought, okay, yes, this makes a lot of sense. This doesn't look very controversial at all, does it? I don't think it does myself. I think a lot of Aquinas' distinctions very easy, very obvious, in fact. I think metaphysics, by the way, very obvious stuff, okay? So I think a lot of this is not very complicated. The complicated part is applying it. Here's an application, okay? So look, notice this is a big implication of the view. This is an obvious one, right? Anything that is potentially some way depends on something else, right? To exist. You can't have something that is pure potential. Because if you had something that was pure potential, but actual in no way, that's another way of saying it doesn't exist, right? So that's why Aquinas thought mass, matter, that was no kind at all, doesn't exist. There's no such thing as this by itself. There's only mass of stuff, right? Only this stuff have mass. If you said, I have some mass here, but it doesn't belong, there's no kind of stuff, just mass. That doesn't exist. There's no way to have mass by itself without any kind of matter, right? That's because mass in this context is a kind of property that depends on a particular thing, right? You can't have mass without things, right? In the same way, any potential in this system depends on something being actual, right? This thing can't have potential or actual kinetic energy unless it exists. If this was gone, you couldn't have potential and kinetic energy here by itself. It's a property of material objects. But this also implies changes. Changes are also dependent in the order of causality, right? Something can't become hot, right? Unless it has a potential to be hot. It's a kind of subject that can be hot like this. This can heat up. But it also then, something has to actually heat it up, right? I could break the batteries inside and heat it up that way with the chemicals. I could shine a laser on it. I could stick it real close to something else that's hot, and then it will get hot that way. But that thing has to have the actual quality of being hot or the power of being able to cause hot in this. Otherwise, this won't get hot just by itself. There's nothing about its structure, its plastic, that will heat up by itself, right? So that's important because there are some things that do heat up by themselves, right? You can have, for instance, there's kind of radioactive materials, right? You have uranium-236 and these kind of isotopes, 234. They break down over time. When they break down, they have a structure and they break down automatically. You just put them out and they break down, right? You don't have to do anything. I don't have to poke them to get them to start breaking. The neutrons and protons will start splitting out, right, and decomposing. They do it automatically and they get hot, right? That's how we put them together and we create a nuclear fission reactor to heat up water and boil it for an electric plant, right? So I didn't have to do anything, but those breakdowns happen randomly by the thing itself. But on Aquinas' view, remember, it's existing and having that molecular that atomic structure is already a kind of being an act, being in actuality, right? Because it exists. If it didn't exist, the uranium-234 atom, it wouldn't break down at all, right? Something that doesn't exist can't break down. So by putting it together that way, by having the atomic structure it does, we're explaining why it's doing the things it does. That's an instance of something depending on actuality, even though in this case it's depending on its internal structure, right? So I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit, but Aquinas thinks these principles allow us to prove God exists. I haven't introduced very much, have I? This isn't actually all that complicated from his point of view. He thinks these basic metaphysical principles allow us to prove God exists. He thinks, by the way, he thinks many people automatically, as it were, in the back of their minds, reason to the existence of God. And he thinks it's very easy, I think. Now, making the proof technical and formal, I think, is hard. but I don't think it's that hard in general, the reasoning to get to God on his view. So here's a very technical formulation. I shouldn't say this isn't very technical. This is a fairly simplified version of one of Aquinas's arguments. But I'll just give it to you straightforwardly, and we can talk about it if you want. But here's the argument. This is what his first way in the Summa Theologiae. I'm also appealing to a few things from the Summa Contra Gentiles, but I'm going to very simply just present it. Okay? Things are changing. Some things somewhere are changing. Okay? But change, remember, we've just given the account of change, moving from potential to actuality. And whatever becomes actual from some state of being potential, requires something else to cause the actuality in it. Whatever causes actuality must itself be actual. So we can summarize this principle: you can't give what you don't have. So if you aren't already actual in some way, you can't bring about actuality in something else. Right? It's impossible something could cause itself to be actual in the same time and respect. So like the uranium-234 is causing itself to shoot out protons, but it's not giving itself the power to shoot out protons, right? It doesn't cause itself to exist, right? So it has causes some things in one part. Another example, right? I raise my arm. This part of me and the muscles are causing my arm to be raised. The muscles are not raising themselves, right? They don't act on themselves. They're acting on the bone, right? And the other things to move it, right? Whatever is changing requires something else to cause whatever that change involves, but this cannot go to infinity, since each change would not happen without depending on whatever is causing the change. So here's a simplified counterfactual. If there were no causes of the change that change the rest, nothing else would be changing. Okay? But because that can't go to infinity, you need something that doesn't have any potential at all. Something that causes other things but has no potential to be changed whatsoever. That's what he calls the first cause, the first mover, an unmoved mover, something that changes other things but cannot be changed or is not changed. And he says this everyone understands to be God. Okay? So I'm going to skip over some of this, but I'll just point out one claim here, which is, from Aquinas' view, this proof doesn't show us automatically. You might say, well, this doesn't look like God. It's an unchanged, changing thing. It changes other things, but how do I know that's God? Why would we think that's God? Well, basically, he thinks we can reason from this, the nature of this thing, to all sorts of properties about it. I'll show you in just a second. But let me give you one caution, which is this argument doesn't depend on the world beginning to exist in time. So in contemporary astrophysics, they think the world did begin to exist in time. I think that's a very typical explanation of Big Bang cosmology, is that before the Big Bang, there was nothing, or the universe's time starts at a particular moment. Now, if that were true, then I think this principle would be obvious, that prior to the existence of the universe, something would need to cause it, right? It shouldn't just start on its own from point zero, right? So I think if the universe began to exist in time, you'd have a very good argument for God's existence. But Aquinas' argument, Aquinas himself did not think that this argument required us to know whether the universe began to exist in time. In fact, he thought we can't know. He thought from science, he thought actually we can't know. And by the way, that's, I think, also what Stephen Hawking's position is on cosmology. He thinks the Big Bang shows us there's like a first moment, but he thought that you couldn't say whether there was anything before or what caused it. And I think that's actually Aquinas' position, by the way. He thought even if our universe began to exist in time, you couldn't really exactly prove it. But so what does he think can be proved is this argument doesn't depend on the universe starting to exist. So even if the universe existed forever, the material universe, he thinks you'd still need this unchanging changer to explain why things were happening at all. So this is a kind of argument from contingency and necessity. Things that have potential could be many different ways. The universe's space-time could be many different distributions. Why is it this one? Why does it exist at all? Well, because anything that is material has potential to change, you need some explanation that is necessary. So at the root of everything, you need a fully necessary explanation for why the universe is the way it is. So this is part of the explanation appealing to God. So there are certain moves here that are controversial, and we can talk about them in just a minute. I'm almost done. I'll give you one more argument that I think is also interesting from that good and being is convertible. Here's a very brief remark Aquinas makes in Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Capita 71. He's dealing with a famous objection to God's existence. Do you know the problem of evil? You ever heard of the problem of evil? What's the problem of evil? Right. So a classic formulation in contemporary philosophy of religion is, if there is a God who is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, how could there be evil in the world? Suffering or moral evil, right? Because it looks like if God is all good or all loving, he should want to eliminate all evil. Okay? This is Aquinas's interesting response. He has a direct response to that problem, but he gives an initial claim that I think is very cool. Here's what he says. But it could be argued to the contrary. If evil exists, then God exists. For there would be no evil if there was no good. And good involves an order, right? Because there are ways things ought to be, right? Natural kinds that could be better or worse. Since a privation is evil. But this order would not exist if there were no God. So he turns it into an argument for God's existence. So here's a complicated version of the argument. We can come back to it at the end, but basically here's my brief outline. A friend of mine in his book, The Best Argument for God, gives this argument. I've changed it a little. But he says there are instances of moral evil, pick your kind of evil, some kinds of failure in the world. A natural state or event would not count as a failure unless there was a normatively natural state, right? So nothing would be sick, for instance. Nothing would be sick or healthy if all there were particles, right? Like imagine a pile of sand. A pile of sand can't be healthy or sick. If we just take that stuff and we just say there's sand here, there are particles, but there's no way they should be, then they can't be healthy or sick, right? They can't be better or worse anything. But normative facts, these are normative facts, good and evil, healthy and sick, failure and success. My friend gives this as what we call an abductive argument. This is very popular in contemporary philosophy of religion, that theism makes better sense of the world if God exists, better explanation of the world than if no God. So that's how I've put this argument. Normative facts would be adequately explained if there was a God, because God would be an intelligent agent which doesn't need any such normative structuring. God, on Aquinas' view, I'm going to get to in just a second, is completely unchanging, completely simple, no parts at all, complete actuality. Well, that's exactly what we think is the case. So we would have an adequate explanation of all structure in the universe if there was a God. But if we were reductive naturalists, naturalism is a complicated term in contemporary philosophy of religion. It basically means materialist, somebody who thinks there's only matter. But we call it naturalist because it's very hard to say what this view really is, okay? Because it's usually basically the view there is no God. But what exactly that means is very hard to say. So some people say it's what our best physics predicts the world is like. Very hard to say what this term means, but basically materialist, okay? And reductive means there's nothing above the matter. The matter is just organized in certain ways, but there's nothing further, okay? If we had normative facts they wouldn't be explainable by reductive naturalism. So if you go, for instance, there are in philosophy of mind, there are, like, for instance, these people, the Churchills. I don't know if you've ever heard of these people. The Churchills are two philosophers of mind who are reductive materialists. They think there is no mind, there is no feelings. So if I say, why did I come here to give you a lecture? I can't say because I wanted to, because I was invited. Because those inviting, wanting, not part of reality. What's part of reality? Things happening in my brain. So if I want to explain why I was here, I would just say, well, some particles fired and moved around here, and that's why I'm here today, right? But that would eliminate good and evil. No good and evil. If there's just firing in your brain, no good and evil. We could try to be non-reductive naturalists, which is we could say there still is good and evil, but there's no God, there's just matter. But this gets very complicated because I think most people think there are problems with this. I can come back to it. But basically, these normative facts might be brute. We call them brute facts. They have no further explanation, or they're somehow a result of chance. But this looks a real serious problem, many people think. So if we judge just by explanatory adequacy and simplicity, the thesis, God exists, would account for all of the existence of evil better than materialism. So I think that's a good thing. Now, the end I just want to say is, for Aquinas, he thinks from all these arguments of what God is, of the unmoved mover and that, we can reason to what God is like. Here's the most important and interesting conclusion that I've already alluded to. God is without composition. He has no parts whatsoever. God is one in a radical way. Why? Here's a brief proof. God is the source of everything. That's the idea, right? God is the source of all actuality in everything, right? That's the whole idea. That's what we're reasoning to, is a principle that explains why there's actuality in anything. But then we can argue God can't have any parts. Why? Because parts involve potential to be different ways. You can change parts, or if you can't change parts, right, one part has a potential that another part does not. And God can't have any potential at all. That's precisely the explanatory claim. We say anything that has potential to be a different way needs to be explained by something that's actual. So God can't have any potential at all. But if parts involve potential, then God can't have parts, right? And we can reason all the way back to all of the claims I made on the first slides. Remember, I was talking about where potential comes from: parts, properties, genus, species, distinction. God can't have any of those. None of them. Zero. God can't have material parts. He can't be in space because you could change location, right? Potential to change location or disposition of parts. God can't have that. He can't have any properties at all, separate from what he is, right? We might be able to say things about God that are true, like God is wise and God is good. Those can be true, but not in virtue of God being different ways like we are, right? I can be hot on my left side. God can't be hot on his left side. God can't be thinking about something today that he's not thinking about tomorrow. So you can deny all of that. And at the end, here's one of the most important things. God can't be part of this picture. God is not a member of any kind at all. What God is identical with his act of existing. So Aquinas says the best name for God is he who is. This comes from the Old Testament. It's what Moses is told God's name is. Because God is being itself subsistent. He's not a thing belonging under any kind of classification, because these classifications are possible ways things could be. God has no possible ways he could be. He's always the way he is necessarily. So we couldn't classify him like that. And there's much more. I could give you my full breakdown of all the properties from this. But I'll just say, what's the upshot of all this? Well, we're going to come back next session tomorrow, to talk about Aquinas' ethics. The metaphysics already gives us some important stuff. I think it makes sense. I think the things that I've mentioned here are pretty basic distinctions. I don't think they're all that complicated. But if these arguments are sound, I think they're valid, clearly. that Aquinas' argument follows. It's logically valid. But if it's sound, if the premises are true, well, the conclusion is very important, if true. And so we're going to see the ethical implications of all these metaphysical things, including that third implication, the existence of God, because it would be big if true. So on that note, that's all I have for today. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to turn off the recording and we can have some questions. I'll leave this up if you're interested in properties of God, how we get the other divine properties. How do I turn off recording? Is this it? Is this the recording? Okay. Nope. Here we are.
I know
The other way.
you